Okay, we are recording. Steve Levine, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you joining me today. And I'm presuming this is this a home studio? Is this a studio that you use elsewhere?
No, it's my own private studio, so it's no longer in my home. I have had home studios in the past, but with the amount of equipment and also the needs of the bands, having a home studio was becoming quite an impact on my private life. And
Yeah,
so this is a private studio, but it is a separate from my home.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm going to kick off your playlist, Steve, and I'm going to ask you, please, to tell me the song that you regard as having the greatest ever intro, please.
Well, those that know me know that I have an incredibly wide taste of music. So when you proposed this to me, I thought, well, are you a rock guy or are you a soul guy or are you a pop guy? Because I don't know what your favorites are. So narrowing it down to one was impossible. So I've given you three choices from the three sort of genres, if you like. So without a question, my favorite rock intro is Enter Sandman by Metallica.
Hmm.
You hear that, it's incredible. In the kind of soul area, it was really hard, but I've gone with Best of Your Love by the Emotions because the
What a
moment you hear
record.
that, and also that's one of the greatest syncs ever for those that were able to see Boogie Nights. The beginning scene where they use that track shows how powerful that intro was. And then in the pop world, my teenage years were spent with the sort of glam rock period. So Tiger Feet, from the moment you hear the hey,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I want to ask you to sort of put your producer's hat on for a moment, Steve, and and talk a little about how you approach the production of music now, because it what I think we've seen maybe from the early days of when you started producing to where we're at now is the way that people consume their music is far different. You know, people are using streaming services and we're seeing record labels utilizing social media platforms like TikTok and such to market music to bigger audiences. Um, and one of the things that I find just through watching the people on the dance floors in my venue and watching my children's habits is it appears attention spans seem to be getting kind of shorter and I wonder if any of that has ever sort of made its way, like these changes, if they've ever sort of factored into your creative process.
no, not at all. The only um, compromises that one makes now is in the final process, knowing that a large number of consumers are going to be using Spotify or some other service. You are aware of the sort of limitations of the bandwidth, particularly Spotify. I mean, if anyone does an A/B between Spotify and Apple, there's a massive difference. And that's not even if you do a Dolby Atmos. So, in many ways, there's a compromise on the lower end, but the opposite on the higher end. So, those that have the luxury of a home cinema system, they're appreciating audio in a level that's never been available before. You know, if you play your music through your home cinema system, particularly if you have a Dolby Atmos track on Apple or something, the sonic impact is phenomenal. So in many ways, it's got better at the higher end, and the quality of headphones has gone up enormously, even over the last couple of years. The quality of headphones have gone up, and also people have started to appreciate the quality of the interface between their device. So even if you're listening on your phone, you can have these little devices that really improve the audio dramatically. So as a record producer, it's kind of come home to roost. I'm really pleased. All the effort that you put into the crafting of the record is certainly appreciated by some. But as I said, you do make one or two compromises by just double checking a few things on headphones to make sure they will translate to the sort of lower end. But that's no different to during the 80s when I would do a mix, I would mix it to the master, but I would immediately mix it onto a cassette and then go and sit in somebody's car outside the studio and listen to it on the car system. And before that, American producers, because of the way that the licensing law was with FM transmitters, many studios in California, particularly, had small FM transmitters in their control room, and they could send the signal from the mixing console into the car in the car lot, which you couldn't do then because you weren't allowed to have those transmitters in the UK. But I remember listening to mixes in American studios where they press a button, send it to the little thing, and you go out into the car and tune the car in, so you get a sense of
That's
how.
fantastic.
So nothing has really ever changed. And I remember hearing things of some of the early producers, Sam Phillips and Berry Gordy, when they were cutting discs on early rock and roll or Motown, of hearing how that record would sound in, you mentioned a club, taking acetate to a club and listening to it. And if it didn't sound right, they would make changes. So I don't think anything has really changed. The world of production is you do the very best job you can with the tools that you have in the period of time you're working, but there are different levels of audience, and I'm really pleased to say that things are definitely getting better and better. My most recent record, um, with MT Jones, I've had some phenomenal reviews on that, and particularly where people have pointed out things in the production which really gladdens my heart, because that's what you do it for. When people say, "Oh, I really love the way those string and all the things on that record are real," I love the way the strings and the horns interact with the backing vocals. That is what you do the job for. Absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful. Steve, for your second track, I'm going to ask you, please, to tell me the first record you remember hearing that had an emotional impact on you, please.
Well, this is very, very easy because I was born in Hampstead in London and grew up in Muswell Hill. And my mother's friend, Rita, was Jamaican, but she had a son who was the same age as me who was autistic. And his autistic sort of hyper reality was listening to rhythm on records. So we were only 5 or 6 when these records were coming out. And Brian's father was a kind of sales executive for Austin Morris Cars. And for those that may or may not know the history of Jamaica, that when Jamaica went independent in 1961, I think it was 61, wasn't it? 60 or 61. They continued to have the Morris cars there, and he would go regularly to service them. But he would also bring back the early reggae, Motown. In fact, they weren't called reggae records, and they were ska or new beat.
Yeah.
And one of the records he brought was Al Capone, Prince Buster. And I really remember Brian had a Dan set record player. And I remember him putting the record on, and instantly things jumped out at me. First of all, for those that may or may not know the record, there's sound effects at the beginning of the record. That was really unusual
Is it
then.
like a car screech?
There's like gunshots and a car scream, and then
Yeah,
the voiceover, Al Capone's cars don't like, which Madness sampled on
yeah,
that later on. And the thing is that I was listening to music, Rita's whole house, or Brian was the youngest of his family, so everyone older in his household was listening to music. My family were listening to music, so I was really bombarded. My grandfather played piano and played banjo, so music was all around us. And my aunt was in West End and Broadway musicals. So I was tons and tons of music being absorbed, even at that very early stage. When Brian put that record on, it sounded so different. If you put it on now, it sounds so different. And bearing in mind, at that period of time, it was rock and roll and the very, very beginnings of the Beatles. And I remember hearing that and hearing, I think it was Love Me Do or possibly Please Please Me, whatever that he had, how different those two records sounded. And also, he had some very early Motown. Um, why do those records? And it really it stays with me to this day. And interesting with my work with Culture Club, that sound of those reggae studios was so different to anything else because we now know they had limited equipment and they had to use incredible skills to create those records. So absolutely, I can be very clear that that particular record is like, oh my God, this is really different. Why does it sound different? And then as I got older, I investigated why it sounds so different.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I know it's not your choice when we get to the question of the first record that you ever bought, but that was the first record that I ever owned.
What? Foster.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
I think it was my nan. Uh, I think she must have bought it for my uncle or something. But I was just a kid, and I was just obsessed with it, like anything that sounded a little bit odd. And this
how
was,
old are you then? How
I'm
old are you?
51,
Right, right.
and 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 yeah, and I remember just thinking, oh my God, this sounds like nothing I'd ever heard before, and it felt a bit like a novelty record as a child. I just thought, oh, this is fun.
It
This
must
is a
have been when I heard it. It must have been its first release. It must have been around 64 or 65 because I think the record came out in the UK in 64 maybe, and
right.
it was definitely before I went to primary school.
Yeah.
So so that I can date it roughly around then maybe. Um, as many people know, the records that were available in the Caribbean were often several years ahead of any British release, including many of the Motown records that became successful towards the end of the 60s were
Mm,
actually released early in the 60s in America, but often failed to become big hits.
mm. I'm going to ask you for your third track, Stephen. Can you please tell me the song that reminds you of your time at school, please?
So when I was at school, I went to a boys' school in Canterbury, and we had a common room. So we were allowed during the lunch hour to play a record. We had a pretty decent hi-fi actually. So the thing was, depending on the day of the week, I seem to remember having things like a double maths before lunch and then having to leg it like hell to get into the common room. So we had a very strange set of students because again, if you think back to that 70s period, you had the kind of kids that loved glam rock and reggae because there was the skinhead thing and
Hmm.
a huge love of all kinds of Trojan records. I really adored those Trojan records. And then we had the kind of hippies that liked Yes and all that kind of stuff. So if whoever got to the common room first got their record on. So for me, if I was lucky enough to get there first, I could put on Stevie Wonder. And at that time, Talking Book was and is still, an incredibly important album to me. Whereas if we missed it and we had to suffer Tales of the Topographic Ocean for the entire lunch break, that was terrible. So yeah, I would say for that, in terms of that particular school days, is that record, but also Barry White's Love Unlimited, because that was the first record that was a gift to me, and was just so lovely. And again, with school, um, we had a metalwork. I was really good at metalwork. In fact, it's the only O level I've got. Is I've got a metalwork O level. That's it. Um, but we used to have those really big drills with the big. We had some fantastic equipment. We had those really big drills, and the drills used to have an emergency stop on the bottom of them. A really
That's
big.
right.
Well, when you press it really hard, it sounded like a wah wah pedal. And we were allowed in I didn't know what a wah wah pedal was, by the way, exactly at that age, but I knew that sound, back to the sound thing. We were allowed to have the radio on in the metalwork room because it was so hot, with the furnace. So we just, even in the winter, we had the doors open, but we used to have the radio on while we were doing it. And we often had our metalwork was after lunch. So if we had the radio on, and I really remember Love's Thing being on the radio quite a lot, it was a big hit, and that we would all play Wah Wah with our drill in time. Anyway,
you,
so it's those that remind me of school. Always, always remind me of school.
you mentioned Trojan and reggae and such, and was your love of that music a key factor in you working with Culture Club and there because that they were, I know that for reading Georgie's books, he's very he's never kept it a secret, his love of reggae, and there was obviously influence like big influences on them early tracks.
It wasn't a reason, but when we had conversations about what we loved, we all had the same understanding. The three or four things that we all love were the
Mm,
same. We loved all that Trojan stuff. We all love all the Philadelphia International and later Motown music that's of that same sound. We also love all the glam rock stuff, including Roxy Music, David Bowie. So our loves were absolutely identical, and that really helped in terms of shaping the sound.
fantastic. Side note: Culture Club played their first ever gig at my venue, and it was. I'm just up the road from where Roy lived, and so yeah, their first ever show. They played my venue that was then called Crocs.
Right. Yes, they remember that well. I think Roy was still a hairdresser at that time.
He was.
And in fact, didn't have a guitar because on the demos, it's actually my guitar that's on those tracks.
Is that
So,
true? Wow. Um, Tell me a little bit about school. I mean, you mentioned that you were born in Hampstead, and then you said that you went to school in Canterbury. So, how did you find yourself down there? And was school something that you enjoyed as well?
yes, well, I was of the generation where you did an 11 plus. So I passed my 11 plus as my sister. I'm one of four. So myself and my sister passed our 11 pluses. So we had the opportunity to go to either a grammar school or, as they were called then, technical schools, they were kind of above the secondary school, but slightly below the grammar school. They had much more practical stuff. And the thing that really drew me to that school was you could do separate physics, chemistry, biology, and also I did a separate electronics after school club, which I really enjoyed. And that was really important. I had a great electronics teacher, Mr. Page, who showed me, I in fact made my own disco equipment and made my own lighting. And he really helped. There used to be magazines in those days called Practical Electronics and things where you could get the magazine and there would be like a kind of circuit of the week. And it showed you could go to Maplin as it was then, and get and order the parts and then make the thing, whatever it was you were making. So he used to help me with that and he was fantastic. So we moved. The reason we moved to Kent was all sorts of reasons. I mean, I won't go into that because quite a lot that's private and personal with our strange family. But one of the reasons was that I went to Coleful in Muswell Hill, and it was getting quite rough, that school, and there was quite a lot of racism and violence towards a lot of the kids, and it seemed that I would get a better education if we moved away from there. I mean, Muswell Hill is so gentrified now, but at the time there were
Yeah.
lots of Jamaican families there. There were lots of Greek families there, or Turkish families, and it was a rougher area than it was now, and I it didn't feel that it was quite right. So my mum decided that we should move away. And so in a way, it probably was a good thing because I feel I had a pretty good education.
Did Did you know what you wanted to be when you was at school, Steve?
Yeah, yes. From about maybe 12 or 13, I didn't know exactly what it was called, but from about 12 or 13, I wanted to make records. And I remember seeing a documentary. You can see some of it online. There's a famous documentary of Phil Spector in the studio with Larry Levine, his engineer. And unusually, Larry spelt his name the same as mine because a lot of Americans spelt it Levene as opposed to
Mm.
I. And I remember it said, Phil with Larry Levine at the controls, and I thought, that's what I want to do. And having, as we were mentioning earlier, I had a fascination with the way the record sounded from quite an early age. And once I sort of saw that, I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be a sound engineer. And then realized actually it was a producer. But yeah, I've always wanted to do it. I thankfully have never done anything else. The moment I left school, I've worked in a studio. So I've been in the studio every day since I was 17.
Fantastic.
This is my 50th year this year. Started in July 75.
Wonderful. Steve, I'm going to ask you now to tell me the first song you remember buying from a record shop, please.
Well, because of my love of music, I requested record tokens as it was very much the thing there. So the first record I bought was Slade Alive and quickly followed it with this because they didn't give you change with record
That's
tokens.
right.
So the second one was the Motown Chartbusters Volume 3, the one with the silver cover. And I still have my copy of Slade Alive, which I got Noddy to sign a couple of years ago, actually. So I now have it signed. But it was my original copy with and back to the thing we said about school. We had a Dymo label maker, and so it's
Yeah.
got my name. They used to go in a rack so that people wouldn't steal them. So it's got Stephen A. Levine and Dymo on the.
Wonderful.
So Slade Alive, yeah.
And that I've still got that Motown album. That was in my parents' collection, and that was one that I nicked when I discovered my love of music. That is a solid compilation. That one.
It's one of the good ones because it's also got some things on it that were harder to get hold of, like Behind a Painted Smile, and
Mm,
some other kind of. It's got all the great ones because it's a phenomenal cover. So I regularly bought those Motown Chartbusters regularly after that, and I've got several of them still. And the famous one, I think, was it which is the one with the fruit machine? Was that five or there's one with the fruit which I've got? It's like it must have been an incredibly complicated cover to make because it's got like a disc on it. I think
mm.
five or nine. I can't remember which one it is, but I've got a few of them still. Yeah, I kept some of my records.
Do you know what? I have not heard Behind a Painted Smile for a long, long time. That is a fantastic record, isn't
Mark
it?
Johnson. See,
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
got some great ones on there. I mean, it's a really great album because you don't hear that one very often, do you? There's lots.
no.
There's a few absolute gems that very occasionally, slip through, and that's particularly one I
Yeah,
just comes to mind. Then you see,
absolutely. I think Smokey's got two tracks on that one. I think Tears of a Clown and Tracks of My Tears are on that compilation. I might be wrong. I might be wrong. I know Roadrunner's on there, and it should have
and
been Me's on there.
I think it goes to my house on that one. Maybe I don't know.
No, no, no. I love that, and I'm sure. And I was late to hearing that. That was not on that one. I'm sure. But what a record that is. Um, okay, so I'm going to ask you now, please, Steve, to tell me the song that soundtrack to your year's clubbing, please.
Well, so we at school. So I mentioned my electronics teacher. So part of my project for fifth year was to make a disco, as it was called then. So we bought the two Garrard SP25 decks. We managed to get those, but I made the bit that goes in between the mixer. And we also had a plexiglass thing. We had a lot of really good gear at the school, I must admit. So one of those things, so you had to buy the perspex, but it bent it in the shape, so it looked really professional. And drilled holes in it, and he helped me make a strobe. And I had to go to this television surplus place to get the capacitor that you need for the strobe light, and it was like it's so dangerous. It really is because I mean, no health and safety in those days because 600 volts across.
Yeah,
So I would do the school disco at the end of term. That was the thing. Because that was the other thing. I wanted to make records, but I never wanted to be in a band. My dear friend, maybe you'll listen to this. My dear friend Paul Felix, who could play, who was in a band, I used to do the sound, and I do remember um, them doing Gene Genie and some stuff like that. And I just, oh God, this sounds so terrible, And I just that was the other thing. Live music to me at the time always sounded awful. Records sounded so great. So when I would do the disco, it was brilliant. And that then went on to I was having my hair cut one day, and the guy that was cutting my hair said, "I do a disco as well. I hear you do." And he said, "Why don't?" And I couldn't drive then because I was 16. And he said, "Well, why don't we combine? Because you've got really good lights and everything." So I did a few with him, and he used to get these corporate gigs that were really good. And that was just as the start of the 12-inch singles were coming out. And one of the ones that I had was T Connection, Do Anything You Want to Do. And that really literally. So what we used to do was we'd set that up, and and anyone that knows that record, it goes to like a bongo thing in the middle.
hmm.
I'd get the strobe light ready, and it would go dum, 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 and it would be so 100% that track.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. And where was as you got older and would you go out clubbing as well?
Not really. Um, I mean, through my teenage years, yes, but then once I started in the studios, I tended to not go to clubs that much unless there were two things I did. Actually, now you said it, it's reminded me of one thing. So when I left CBS, Simon Humphrey and I did a record ourselves because it was starting to. I was very impressed by Sharon and Giorgio Moroder and the start of what became producers being the artist.
Mm.
And so I said to Simon, we should make a disco record. It'd be, that this is what producers do. We'll get some session players in. So we actually had um, a couple of releases, and one of them started to do quite well. And so we did a little tour of clubs. I remember going to Barry Island and places like that. So yes, in that period, but then very soon after that, I was going to pubs and clubs to see bands because then I was then effectively engineering.
Yeah.
So go as in London, then we go to all of the various venues, Greyhound. Um, that was always very, very popular. And all the stuff, all the various venues in Camden Town, all their names keep changing all the time. But there was a block of them that we would go. Even the Nashville rooms in Hammersmith was like really quite popular. So I'd go to quite a lot of those rather than clubs per
Yeah.
se. But if we had a release, um, it would be something you'd go and listen to it. As I said earlier, we'd cut an acetate. And then when I went to, after sort of, it was the very end of the 70s, I went to California at the bequest of Bruce Johnson. I remember going to the American clubs there with one of his team. And I thought, oh my God, this is because the sound system in those clubs was absolutely breathtaking. I mean,
Bruce Johnson of the Beach Boys, yeah?
yeah, yeah. Kurt Betcher, who was the assistant on the sessions vocal producer, he um, was very much into well, it was the beginnings of what was the American gay club scene. So I went with him to some of those clubs. Oh my God, it was incredible. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I'd never heard a sound system so good in a club, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not a regular, but I have been to various ones. I never went to Studio 54 or anything like that.
Yeah. But those like those gay clubs in the States were ahead of the game
Absolutely
with what was going on musically.
incredible. It was a real eye opener. It really was.
So how did you because am I right in saying that you're you know you're good friends with Bruce Johnson and like how did that come about?
So I was a staff engineer at CBS Studios. Well, in fact, I wasn't officially an engineer. I was a tape op assistant. But CBS Studios were lagging behind the curve with regard to equipment which today would be incredibly valuable and sought after. Sorry, get rid of that. You can probably cut that little bit out. I apologize. Um, so MCI was the new way forward. That was the new recording setup because for several reasons. First of all, you had a 24 track machine. You had automated mixing, which for the first time was actually reliable and worked. And you also had this kind of, or MCI set up this thing where you could buy the whole lot. You got the mixing console, the 24 track, the 2 track machine. It was an incredible deal. And so CBS decided, right, we're going to go that route because that's really taking off in America. At that point, everyone had Neves. SSL hadn't really come into the marketplace at that point. So American producers really loved that way of working. Most famously, they had them in Miami and the Bee Gees and many of that Criteria Sounds. In fact, they probably had the first one actually because MCI was based in Florida. So CBS being a multinational company and being particularly an American company, and a lot of the clients that were coming over were from the American part of the label. So Bruce Johnson was choosing a studio to use and chose CBS Studios because they gave them a better deal if they kept it in house. And he was going to produce the next Sailor album. I had worked with Sailor on all their demos and some of their album as an assistant. But when Bruce booked the session, CBS put an engineer on the session with him who had not understood the console. It's really hard to understand work methods. So for those that don't know, the older Neve console was actually based on incredible vintage technology. The left-hand side had the microphones, the right-hand side had the monitors, and you recorded onto 8 or 16 track tape. And you had 28 faders for your inputs and 16 monitors for your 16 tracks. That was how it worked. ABC, really easy. The MCI was totally different. You had a large number of channels. I think we had 42 on ours, and any channel could be a monitor, a fader for a microphone, a fader for a line input. You decided. So if you've work the old way for your entire career, sat in front of an MCI console is, oh my God. Whereas I didn't have the baggage because I hadn't grown up with that. I'd only just learnt to use the Neve desk. So for me, it wasn't a big unlearning curve. Plus, I helped install the desk because I needed the overtime. So I really understood how the desk worked. So Bruce said to the manager of the studio, I want Steve to be the engineer with Kurt because Steve knows how the desk works. And the engineer that you've assigned just doesn't know how it's working. Everything is taking so long. And Dave Carey, the manager, said, but Steve's not an engineer. He's an assistant. He's not, been promoted. So Bruce very nicely said, then I'll take my work elsewhere. And so they then let me have. And the other thing you have to remember, I was only 18, 19 at the time. And that was really, really young to be an engineer. Consequently, there was a funny vibe, because I then had tape ops that were older than me. But nevertheless, it was a great opportunity. And then Bruce then said during the course of the sessions, you really should be a producer. You're wasting your time being an engineer. Your enthusiasm, your knowledge, your understanding. Why don't you come with me to California when this record's finished? I've got 2 or 3 projects that are on the go, and I need your help. So I worked at a couple of studios with him. Again, Beach Boy trivia. The question that you could say in that period of time, which Beach Boy had won a Grammy, and at that point it was Bruce Johnson, not Brian Wilson, because Bruce Johnson got a Grammy for the Barry Manilow song, "I Write the Songs," which Bruce wrote. And Bruce had become
Wow.
a big producer. A lot of bands wanted Bruce to produce him because of the vocal harmonies. Because Brian at that point was on, a hiatus. The band themselves were not doing that much. And so Bruce was actually a producer. So I went to California and worked with him on a few different projects. And that was really eye-opening to me because the way that record producers treat their engineers or did at the time in California was very different to England. You were a respected member of the team, very, very important. Whereas in England, you were less important.
So did Bruce produce any Beach Boys records?
Interestingly enough, at that time, the LA album had just come out, and he had got some co-production on that.
Right, yeah. Because
Carl mainly, but Bruce was definitely. I think Carl and Bruce were very active, and that's why years later I produced the Beach Boys album because Bruce said we need Steve to produce the album and I have a long-term relationship. I spoke to Bruce only a couple of months ago, so yeah, it's a lifelong friendship.
I mean, tell me a little bit about what that felt like to produce the Beach Boys.
It was mad. I mean, you've got to look at it.
What year was this, Steve?
84 into 85. The album was released in 85. So this year will be the 40th anniversary of the release of that album. We restarted it in 84 and finished it early 85, and it came out in June 85.
Wow.
I got a call from Bruce to say, please, could you produce the album? And again, they were in a very dodgy time. I mean, hindsight's a very wise thing. I'd learnt lots of things since then, but essentially, they had a new deal with CBS Records and they needed an album. And Culture Club were #1 all around the world. And in America, Culture Club were distributed through CBS, not Virgin, because Virgin didn't have a separate label in those days.
Mm.
So it just was it was a meeting of the minds, and that's how it happened. And that's a whole nother podcast and a whole. But it was mad. It was mad.
Okay. Well, look,
I'm very proud of what we did, and I'm also very proud of the fact that we've got good long-term relationships. And you know, and I can add it to my CV. I'm one of the only people to have produced the Beach Boys other than Brian Wilson.
yeah, amazing.
In fact, I was a question on because my friend clipped it out. It was a question on Mastermind. That's right. Which British producer? Yeah, my friend Paul clipped it out. So I have I'm the answer. Steve Levine was the answer.
Oh, you've made it now. You're on Mastermind.
Yeah,
That's it.
that's why I clipped it. Somebody's subject was Beach Boys, and that was the question: which British producer? Anyway,
Oh, it's fantastic. All right, Steve, I'm going to ask you now to tell me a favourite track from an artist from your home county, please.
so again, this was a difficult one. So I think really using the London connection, it has to be London Calling the Clash. I didn't actually work on that record. Those that know my CV, Simon Humphrey and I were, younger engineers. We did all the demos with the Clash. The Clash then got signed to CBS Records, and they loved the studio. So we continued working on those tracks. So I was initially just the tape op on those sessions, but then as we moved forward, they doubled up the studios. So Simon would work in Studio 3 on stuff, and I would work in Studio 2 on stuff. So the last track that we ever worked on with the Clash was White Man in Hammersmith Palais, which we did split between the two studios because the piano on there was recorded in Studio 2, not Studio 3. That was the last track we did, but obviously we're huge fans of the Clash, and so I guess London Calling sums up not just the sound of London, but also that particular area of London that I know so well.
And one of the greatest ever intros as well.
Yes, another one. Actually, not a great intro, but a really good end as well with the
Mm,
on the guitar. Yeah.
yeah. How did it feel being in the studio and seeing, a young band like the Clash, like, you know, on their way to change the world?
Well, this is the thing. Hindsight is very powerful. At the time, they were just another band that came in, and we worked on so many bands each day. We did have a really good vibe with them straight away. And Mick at the time lived in just by Camden, so I used to drive him home when we finished the sessions because I lived in Hampstead. So I would drive up and drop him off. Generally speaking, around Chalk Farm, because he'd often go to a pub or something, and so I had a good relationship. Again, a relationship which is valuable to this day. Because when I did the cover of "Should I Stay or Should I Go," I sent him a copy which he really loved. So that was a really interesting journey. You could tell that things were going to happen. I mean, it's always easy with hindsight, but they had something that was a little bit different. Because if you did a week of bands, certain ones jumped through. Like I remember when we did some demos with XTC, they had something.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of bands that you never saw again, but definitely they had something. And also, I really remember going to see them live. So that famous picture that's done at the Rainbow, Simon and I went to that gig, and I really,
Wow.
really remember it. And I remember it for two reasons. Number one, we were working with them in the that day, and so they went down to do the sound check. So we had our names on the door, and I really remember it because it's quite a battle to get into the backstage. But the pictures that you see of that Rainbow, taken from the sort of third or fourth row in with the band on stage, that was about it. If you did a picture the other way, you'd see that wasn't quite as full as you think it was.
Yeah.
And I really remember that it wasn't that full. I mean, it wasn't empty, but it wasn't that full. It's not
Yeah.
as full as you think it was. But then they did, grow and grow and grow. But they
Yeah.
have absolutely, absolutely were and are one of the most important bands. And each individual member was really important. And it was also very interesting with the changeover between, I've said this before on interviews, but so Terry Chimes was the drummer on the first set of sessions, and then Topper came in. And Topper, I'd worked with Topper on sessions before then because I worked with some other, as I was an engineer, I used to work for other producers. And there were a couple of other producers I worked with that used Topper as a session drummer. He was a really good session drummer in London. And so when he got the gig, it was like, oh my God, because he really, I mean, Terry is fantastic at what he did, but Topper is actually more so. And I think that was something that really changed the way that it moved forward.
Yeah.
And Topper had more of a modern drummer's approach to it. He could overdub, for example. So there's on some of those tracks, there's a couple of drum overdubs, which you can't tell because they're so tight, which
Hmm.
would have been impossible, a few years previous. Anyway, I digress.
Well, it's your last track, Steve, and I'm going to ask you now to tell the listeners of the show a song that you love that you think they may not know.
Well, back to my jazz stuff. I love Neil Cowley. I think he's a really talented, talented player, and I love many of the things that he did. But I discovered his sort of side project, which is called Fragile State, which is a kind of slightly electronic-y kind of thing. And there's one particular track, The Facts and the Dreams. I would recommend people, A, listen to that track, but also listen to his other stuff. I mean, people will know him from the Neil Cowley Trio. And in fact, they just got a new record out at the moment. But really lovely stuff. Lovely, it's enjoyable from a just a sort of plain point of view. And then when you delve into how well it's arranged and then the instruments and the various keyboard parts, it's a great record. So I would highly recommend that.
Well, we make it nice and easy for people to go and listen to that, Steve, and all the other songs that we've spoken about today, because we put together a little Spotify playlist to accompany the show so people can go and listen to all the music that we've been speaking about today. Now, we've not really spoken too much about what you're up to. So what's going on in the world of Steve Levine right now?
Well, everything Baltic Jazz recordings at the moment. We've just had, well, last year we had huge success with the releases we had. The two current ones are the MT Jones Forever and a Day, which is doing really, really well. And we did do a quick Christmas release. We've got when's this podcast going out?
In about 4 weeks, I think.
Okay, so then our next release, because then you can cut around this. So we have the next Baltic Jazz release will be a collaboration with Mavie and Marco from Mama Terra. So we've done this really great track. Just before Christmas, Marco came down and we've written 4 songs, but we've finished this one particular one, which is really good. It's called Futuristic. So that'll be out on the 14th of March. Really excited by that. I'm currently in the studio as we speak, recording more with Mavie, and those are some other collaborations. So that's the idea of Baltic Jazz is it's like, I guess, like the jazz producers of the 50s and 60s into the 70s, Creed Taylor and people like that, they would have this sort of studio, they would have, artists that would come in, and you'd often have cross pollination of different projects. And I love that. Very similar to Gamble and Huff with MFSB, that
Yeah.
just a set of players and you do different projects. So that's very much what I'm doing at the moment and really enjoying it. And it's great to have the studio to be able to do that. And it's lovely to have the interaction that you have with the audience because I've never had that before. When you enter the jazz world, people are much more proactive and people contact me through the website and say all sorts of really quite lovely things. Even Maeve, actually, she said, "Oh my God, I had these really great emails," because she's never had that before. People just are really quite passionate, and I love that.
Oh, wonderful. You mentioned the website there. Is that the best place to keep up to speed with releases and such?
Yes, I've got balticjazzrecordings.co.uk. I've got a page, and I just update that myself. So as I said, the those are the recent ones, but the 14th of March is Futuristic, the Mavie and Marco Mamatera collaboration. It's really great track. I really love it. Slightly different.
Wonderful. Steve, I'll put the web address in the show notes of this show so people can head over there and look at everything that you've just mentioned. And all that leaves me to say, Steve, thank you so much for giving up your time today. It's been an absolute delight talking records with you.
Thank you. And my absolute pleasure.
I'm going to press stop, but don't go anywhere.